Joining me now, we have Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor and an MSNBC political contributor. Good to see you, Ben. Awfully glad you're here. I'm curious what you think Netanyahu means when he says he will do whatever it takes. How concerned are you by this escalation?
I'm very concerned. I mean, we've seen this kind of at a low boil throughout the conflict since October 7th. The U.S., as recently as, a few days ago before the pager attack, had been trying to negotiate some de-escalation to avoid precisely this scenario. And I think when he talks about whatever it takes, I think what's in people's minds is, will there continue to be kind of large-scale airstrikes into Lebanon? Will there potentially be some kind of Israeli ground incursion, some kind of ground operation into Lebanon, which would dramatically kind of raise the stakes there as well? And in reprisal, Hezbollah could fire a significant number of rockets, more than they have been doing, into Israel. They could also try to undertake certain acts of terrorism, acts of violence inside of Israel's borders. And all of this, and I think this is what the U.S. is concerned about, could also further set the region aflame. You could see violence in a place like Iraq, where Hezbollah has close supporters and the U.S. has a large diplomatic presence. You could see Iran getting drawn in, given how close they are with Hezbollah. Boy. So Netanyahu is not being very specific, but the trend is clearly not good in terms of escalation.
Is it clear to you, Ben, why Israel chose this past week to set off the pager and walkie-talkie explosions in Lebanon?
Well, look, on the security side of things, they've had for months now a large population that is displaced in northern Israel, a lot of frustration about the inability of them to return home because of the Hezbollah rocket fire. I think what the U.S. is focused on is that if you get a ceasefire in Gaza, that all goes away, and that there's a diplomatic solution that can return those people home and recover the hostages. I mean, Alex, it's Prime Minister Netanyahu, and so I think there's also, and this is not a view just of my own, this is a widely held view in Israel, his own politics, have always kind of factored in his decision making. And, the longer he's perpetuating these military operations, the longer he's presenting himself as the kind of indispensable man for Israel's security, that is keeping his political standing, keeping him in power. And frankly, I think, in our own election cycle, he might see the time before an election as a time when U.S. criticism of him may be muted, and so there's always a political dynamic usually with Netanyahu, and I think he sees this as both something that is necessary, although I agree with the criticism from John Kirby that I don't think it's going to help return people home. A war along Israel's northern border is not necessarily the clearest pathway to return those people to their homes, but I also think he has some political interests that are at stake here, too.
Yeah. It is starting to feel like the U.S. is kind of toothless when it comes to the Middle East conflict. I mean, it just seems to be getting worse, right, Ben? The Wall Street Journal, I'm looking at a report this week, senior U.S. officials aren't giving up, but they are not expecting a ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas before Biden's term end. How much of a problem is it that Joe Biden is essentially, look, he's a lame duck president right now. Does it leave the U.S. without any leverage?
Yes, because he's not been willing to use any leverage, in terms of trying to compel a ceasefire. And look, there's been essentially a two-pronged plan from the Biden administration over the course of the last year. One is to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza between Israel and Hamas that leads to the return of hostages and kind of creates the context for the war to end. And two, to have the Saudis normalize relations with Israel as a means of kind of unlocking some pathway to greater peace in the region. Clearly, those ceasefire talks have died. And, no matter how many times they send people to the region, both Israel and Hamas are moving further apart. When you have this kind of escalation, these kinds of attacks on Hezbollah, that doesn't exactly create a climate where you think you're going to get a ceasefire deal either. And just the other day, Mohammed bin Salman announced that he would never normalize relations with Israel absent a Palestinian state, which is essentially a signal that pathway is dead, too. And the problem is that they haven't had a plan B, Alex. Not being willing to say, you know what, if Netanyahu is not willing to make this ceasefire deal to get the hostages back and to get some calm there, then we'll, look at using some leverage, suspending some arms shipments to Israel, voting a certain way at the UN Security Council. If you're essentially saying we're going around the region and we're telling people what we would like to happen, but we're not putting real leverage behind it, what we've seen is that there are actors in the region, including close friends like Israel, that are just beginning to tune that out, and I think that creates a kind of pretty unstable period here. Because we're going to have an election. There's going to be a transition either to a Harris or a Trump administration. This could be a very volatile time. Transitions usually are, Alex, after both Obama elections in 08 and 12, there was a Gaza war. The transitions are often times when leaders try to do things knowing that the U.S. is a bit distracted and inward focused. And I think that's unfortunately the kind of unstable window that we're in right now.
And I know, Ben, you just signed on to a letter with 700 national securities leaders endorsing Kamala Harris. So what could she do to bring a diplomatic end to this conflict, bring back the hostages, prevent the U.S. from being dragged into another war? Would continuing Biden's policies be the best approach to trying to make that happen?
No, I mean, I think she's going to bring a new energy. There'll be a burst of energy with the Harris election. It'll be very welcome around the world, overwhelmingly welcomed around the world. She'll have a lot of political capital, right? She won't have that kind of lame duck status hangover. That alone, I think, is a positive reset in the event of a Harris victory. But then also, I think she needs to kind of go back to the drawing board. She's talked about, and she has used a different tone when it comes to calling out Prime Minister Netanyahu and his willingness to kind of ignore the United States and obviously the circumstances for the Palestinians in Gaza. I think she needs to kind of look at what are the tools, both in terms of trying to get a near-term ceasefire. Is there leverage that can be brought to bear? But really importantly, Alex, part of what is needed now is a vision. Where is this all going? What are we aiming for? A ceasefire alone wouldn't even solve the problems there, right? Who's going to rebuild Gaza? Who's going to run Gaza? Yeah. I think she can come in, and it's as much about what is happening in the inbox today, even more so it's about sketching out a vision of where is U.S. leadership trying to go in this region beyond putting out fires. And I think she has the opportunity to do that in a way that even a second-term Joe Biden wouldn't.
Okay. Sage advice and perspective as always, my friend. Thank you, Ben Rhodes. Appreciate you.